Hello, my name is Chip Fabry and I will be presenting on my research in the area of the ethical treatment of gender identity. Past practice was to apply behavioral modification methods to treat gender identity behaviors. These were the so-called sissy boy experiments. Ethical issues in question are: was the client involved in creating the treatment plan? Were the client's behaviors putting himself or others in danger? Were the client's behaviors socially unacceptable? Is it right to force an individual to change their preferred sexual orientation? My paper will be focusing on the history and research of George A. Rakers. Please note in this research, multiple terms were used to describe the same or similar behaviors and symptoms. They were gender variance, gender variant, cross-gender, and sex role behaviors. The identification of gender variance in boys has been of interest in the science community since the 1950s, at which time it was considered to be psychologically abnormal, unhealthy, and could lead to further psychological issues in adulthood. The 1960s brought a few researchers and clinicians that began to publish their reports on small group or single case studies in feminine boys. Most important among this group were the Johns Hopkins medical psychologist John Money and his student Richard Green. Their first publication appeared in 1960, and they published a series of articles throughout the 60s, which produced some of the first aggregate level systematic studies of gender variant boys. And by the end of the 1960s, Green had emerged as the leading expert in the field of gender variance in children. Due to the lack of support data on outcomes, researchers began to undertake longitudinal studies that followed feminine boys into adulthood. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, UCLA was becoming the leader in the study of gender variant boys. UCLA's Feminine Boys study was a large-scale, government-funded, 15-year prospective study that would compare 66 feminine boys and their families with matched control masculine boys and their families. Green's longitudinal study allowed him to follow feminine boys into adulthood, while other researchers proposed new schema, wherein gender-variant boys were divided into two broad categories representing two syndromes: boys with a disorder of gender role and boys with a disorder of gender identity. This early research and treatment of boys with sex-type behaviors led to the psychiatric diagnosis of gender identity disorder of childhood, which made its first appearance as a formal diagnosis in 1980 as part of the DSM-3. It was later changed in the DSM-4 to gender identity disorder, and then again in the DSM-5 changed to gender dysphoria. George Rakers had a PhD in psychology from UCLA and is a practicing Southern Baptist minister. He was a professor at UCLA, the University of South Carolina Medical School of Medicine, the University of Florida, as well as the department head at Kansas State University and a research fellow at Harvard. He has published numerous journal articles on gender roles among children, including articles on cross-gender, gender-identified boys, and child gender disturbances. He was on the founding board of the Family Research Council and was an advisor and officer with the National Association for Research and Therapy of Homosexuality, as well as other anti-gay affiliations. He was the author of 6 books on homosexuality. These were books for parents on how to treat their homosexual child. Rakers had claimed to spend much of his time with boys, who may often be referred to as sissy or effeminate by family or peers, with the goal of reversing those behaviors in an effort to help the boys become better adapted to themselves and their environment. He viewed homosexuality as a gender disturbance which could be corrected during childhood and adolescence with weekly therapy. He credits himself for developing a method of assessing gender behavior in child's play in 1972. However, he has been accused by some for using aversion therapy and punishing nonconforming behaviors. His work has been criticized by other scholars for reinforcing sexual stereotypes and for reliance on questionable rationales for therapeutic intervention. His methods were opposed by the APA, which led to his resignation from the organization. He has testified in a number of court cases against parenthood by gay or lesbian individuals, claiming homosexuality is destructive. In the Boy Scouts of America hearing, he testified in defense of the group's policy on excluding homosexuals and argued that it was justified because admission of homosexuals would legitimize the value of homosexual behavior in the eyes of many of the Boy Scouts. In the Arkansas gay adoption case, he was an expert witness and argued that it would be in the best interest of foster children to be placed in a heterosexual home, as he believed that since the majority of people in the country disapproved of homosexual behavior, this would put further stress on children who were already likely to suffer from psychological disorders. The judge described Raker's testimony as extremely suspect, and he was there to promote his own personal ideology. In the Florida gay adoption case, Rakers was an expert witness again, and he testified that homosexuals are more likely to suffer from depression, substance abuse, and emotional problems. He also testified that Native Americans would be unsuitable foster parents as they are at high risk for alcohol abuse and psychiatric disorders. The judge said Dr. Raker's testimony was far from a neutral and unbiased recitation of the relevant scientific evidence. With over 100 research studies on gender variance, George Rakers is credited with over 15 research studies. However, I will only focus on a few. The Rakers study of 74 is the study of a boy named Craig identified with cross-gender identification. It's one of the most renowned studies of this kind. The study demonstrated reinforcement control over pronounced feminine behaviors in a male child. The treatment plan included Craig in the clinic and home environments, his mother being trained to be his therapist. During Craig's treatment, his feminine behavior sharply decreased and masculine behavior increased. Follow-up data 3 years after the treatment began suggested that Craig's sex-type behaviors had become normalized. This study suggested it had made a preliminary step towards correcting the pathological sexual development in boys, which may provide a basis for the primary prevention of adult transsexualism or other similar adult sexual deviations. In the 75 study, Raker used discriminative stimulus control over masculine and feminine sex-typed play behaviors with 5 boys aged 5 to 8 years old with childhood cross-gender identification. The study showed that while no single environmental stimulus was consistently discriminative for masculine play across children, at least one stimulus condition was found for each subject under which he played predominantly masculine. In the 77 research, behavioral assessment and diagnostic testing procedures were developed to evaluate the treatment of an 8-year-old boy, Paul, with a profound gender disturbance. When a combined response cost and verbal prompt contingency was applied, the single target mannerism of limping the wrist markedly decreased, and a response generalization of treatment effect occurred to other mannerisms. The 2-year independent follow-up found a marked shift to normal gender role adjustment. The research of Rakers and his colleagues on various aspects of the behavior modification treatments on gender-variant boys wasn't without controversy. The mid-70s, critiques of Rakers' work began to appear primarily in professional journals. In a Rolling Stone expose, it was reported that the Coalition Against the Dehumanization of Children, which had protested UCLA gender programs due to their complicity of fostering so-called normal masculine role behavior. Nordyke and his colleagues argued that Rakers and Lovaas evidently accepted and supported existing sexual stereotyping, and thereby were failing to contribute to the solution of a larger social problem. They even questioned the severity of Rakers' technique, citing a basic therapeutic rule: use the least severe intervention possible. On May 4, 2010, it made the Miami News-Times Rikers Rent Boy scandal. Rikers had admitted to hiring a young man, Giovanni Roman, to carry his luggage. However, through interviews, Roman admitted that he did not carry Raker's luggage, but he was there to give Raker nude daily massages. Roman even believed that Rakers was homosexual. On May 6th, The Daily Show, Jon Stewart pointed out in the photograph that Rakers was the one who was handling his luggage while Roman looked on. On May 7th, the National Association for Research and Therapy of Homosexuality announced they would carry out an inquiry into the accusations of Rakers. During that inquiry, on May 8th, the New York Magazine reported another individual said Rakers hired him in a similar capacity in 1992. Then on May 11th, NARTH announced that Rakers had resigned from its board. The ban on conversion therapy for minors started on September 30, 2012, when California enacted Senate Bill 1172, which would prohibit a mental health provider, as defined, from engaging in sexual orientation change efforts as defined with a patient under the age of 18. This was not without hiccups, as there were two cases brought up in this time. Pickup versus Brown and Welsh versus Brown were both from 2012, and they challenged the constitutionality of California Senate Bill 1172, which banned conversion therapy on children under the age of 18. Interesting fact, though, was the lead plaintiff in Pickup is David Pickup. He was a conversion therapist and a spokesman for the National Association for Research and Therapy of Homosexuality, NARTH, the same organization Rakers belonged to. In December 2012, the district court judge hearing Pickup declined to issue an injunction blocking Senate Bill 1172, but the judge hearing Welsh did issue an injunction. Both cases were appealed to the Ninth Circuit and consolidated. The circuit court heard oral arguments in the cases on April 17, 2013, and on August 29th upheld Senate Bill 1172 and reversed the lower court order granting a preliminary injunction. Illinois signed the Senate Bill or House Bill 217, Public Act 990411, the Youth Mental Health Protection Act to outlaw the performance on minors of sexual orientation change efforts. At the time Illinois signed, Illinois was the fifth state that had passed legislation. May 17, 2017, a conversion therapy bill passed in the state Senate in Delaware and awaits consideration in the House of Representatives. And as of July 2017, there are bills pending in 11 more states, and there are currently 23 counties, municipalities, and communities in 5 states that have passed legislation, with 4 more pending in those states. To recap, was the behavior modification treatment of the children with gender identity issues ethical? Well, there was no evidence to suggest the clients were involved in creating the treatment plan. There was no evidence to suggest the client was in danger of hurting himself or others. The research studies were over 40 years ago, post-World War, and may not have been socially acceptable, but they would be more socially acceptable in today's times. And of course, it is not ethical to force an individual to change their preferred sexual orientation. Rickards was accused of using aversive therapy and punishment. He testified against homosexual individuals, claiming they are more likely to suffer from depression, substance abuse, and emotional problems. He was caught in the Rent Boy scandal, in which he received nude massages from a gay male escort, resigned from NARTH, and from that point on, he does not appear to be seen or heard from. One good thing to come out of all of this, even though it is sad and unfortunate, as this has been for Craig and the others, there is good that has come of it. We now have legislative bans passed or pending on conversion therapy for minors in 17 states, in 27 counties, municipalities, and communities in 5 additional states. Thank you, and good night.